This week we talk about precognition and the radical experiments done by Dr. Daryl Bem.
Hello and welcome back, listeners of the Swerve podcast. It's your co-host, Izzo. I'm also joined here by Magnum.
What's up, everybody? If you're a first-time listener of the podcast and you're wondering what you've stumbled across, we're the Swerve podcast, and we are two random dudes on a mission to understand everything in the universe, one obscure topic at a time. So our premise here is very simple. Every week we pick a topic that we don't really know anything about, usually listener recommended, something that swerves off the mainstream path. We research it and then discuss it on the fly during the podcast. So this week's topic is going to be crazy. We're going to be discussing precognition and going into some scientific studies about it. But before we get into that, Izzo, I think you have some words.
I do. Just before we get started, I want to mention that we have a Patreon.
Yeah, okay.
So that is www.com. Fuck, I did it again. The .com thing. Anyway, it's patreon.com/the Swerve podcast. Simply put, you'll find two tiers. There's a $1 Ride the Wave tier, and that'll give you access to the bonus episodes that we release each month. You'll also get access to that library of episodes that we've released so far. And then for $3 a month, you can join the Slap the Ass tier, and that'll give you access to those bonus episodes. You'll get shout outs on the podcast, but you will also receive all the episodes, main episodes and Patreon episodes, a few days before anyone else. So you'll receive them on Sundays rather than the typical drop time of Wednesdays.
Hell yeah. We also have a tradition on this podcast. Izzo, would you enlighten the audience, please?
Of course, the tradition is that we like to drink while we're recording the episode. And usually we either take listener recommended drinks, classic cocktails, or we kind of keep it basic. So this week I've kept it basic. I have a rye and Coke. So just very, very classic, I guess.
So I have something interesting. It's not that interesting, but basically it's a vodka cream soda. But what is interesting about it is this cream soda, it's a Canadian-based cream soda. It's called the Grizzly Paw Company, or Grizzly Paw Soda Company. And apparently it's brewed with fresh mountain water and cane sugar. So I just came across that randomly, and I was like, hey, I'll use this to mix a vodka. So I got that going on. And in addition to that, I just on deck, I just have a bottle of wine. I'm just drinking straight from the bottle, Bodacious Dark. What else do I have to say? I should also say, listeners, if I sound fucked up, it's because I'm coming off of we can't really say it, I guess, but I'm coming off the cerveza sickness. So I might sound a little plugged up, sick, but that's what that is. How about we hop into the basics now?
Yeah, let's do it.
So today we're going to be talking about a quite strange topic. It's hard for me to even believe this one, but maybe we'll see. You'll see what I mean when we get through it. We're going to be talking about precognition. Now, I don't know. A lot of people might have heard that term, but not really know what it is or how it's defined. But the definition of precognition is the anticipation of future events that could not otherwise be anticipated through any known inferential process. I want to also say, while we're doing this topic, it's highly related to a phenomenon called premonitions. A lot of people are familiar with that. I think there was a movie called Premonition.
With Sandra Bullock. Yeah.
There you go. Yeah. So a lot of people are familiar with premonition, but it's related to precognition, but it's a little bit different. Basically, a premonition lacks conscious cognitive awareness, and it's more of they call an affective apprehension. So it's more like a feeling than it is precognition, which is like the actual information. So we're going to touch on premonition, but really we're talking about precognition. There's a distinction there.
So really what you're trying to say is the movie should have been called Precognition, because Sandra Bullock literally sees the events of the future happening, and then she like acts on them to try and change them. Not just a feeling. Okay. Fuck you, Hollywood.
Yeah, Hollywood error. That's why you come to the Swerve podcast, because we get it right. And these Hollywood budget films, they just get it completely wrong. And I'm fucking sick of it. Moving on. So precognition and premonitions, these are phenomenon referred to as psi. And psi, this is, I guess, like if you're looking in, I don't know, like parapsychology or weird fringe stuff, psi is a phenomenon in which individuals appear to have access to non-local information, that is, to information that would not normally be available to them through any currently known physical or biological process. So quite a broad definition of what psi is. But I want to say a couple more things about it. Psi is it's like a descriptive term, so it doesn't not imply that these phenomenon are paranormal necessarily. That's a common misconception when you hear people say psi, like it's kind of woo-woo and weird. It doesn't necessarily imply that it's weird. It just means we can't explain it with our known laws of physics or biological mechanisms. So that's one thing I want to stress, because when we get out of the basics here, when we get into these scientific studies, precognition is very woo-woo, but like the way that this guy approaches it is not. So I want to make that clear while we're in the basics. But like psi can also include very weird stuff like clairvoyance, clairaudience. We had a previous episode on clairaudience. Remote viewing. We also did an early episode on remote viewing. That was pretty crazy. Telepathy, and obviously precognition and premonition. Those are all examples of kind of what psi includes. And what we're talking about today, it's like a tangent of that. So I'm just trying to make clear in the listener's head, like if you were to talk to like a parapsychologist studying psi, like we're studying like a sliver, or like, you know, what am I saying? Like a category of it. It's not like the whole thing. It's just, there's a lot of weird shit, but precognition is what we're interested in. What's crazy about precognition is it implies retrocausation. So that'll be the word of the podcast today, retrocausation. This is a concept of cause and effect in which an effect precedes its cause in time, and so later events affect an earlier one. So, I don't know, does that make sense? Like that's a weird one to grapple with already. Does that make sense, Izzo?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just having a hard time taking the movie out of my head, because that's exactly what happens. Is like you see what's going to happen in the future, and then it changes like how you act currently.
Yes.
But in the reality of it, like you can't really change it. You might think you're actively trying to change it, but the future comes regardless.
Well, it's actually a little bit different than that. What the retrocausation implies is something you do in the future changes how you changes, literally causes something that happened in the past. So it's weird. It's like what you were saying is a little different than the retrocausation, because they're seeing the future and then trying to change the present. This is like, no, like you're in the future and you do something and it changed the past. I know that's weird. It's weird.
Okay. Yeah.
But we're going to go, when we get through these studies here, this guy did like 9 experiments and like 8 of them proved this. They proved well, I shouldn't say proved, but they suggest retrocausation, which is like baffling, completely baffling.
Okay. I'm following along for now, but we'll see how it goes.
Okay. Basically, like precognition, it's wild. Like you're literally challenging the notion of unidirectional time, because if retrocausation is a thing, that means the future can influence the past. That means that it's not really unidirectional, right? Like things that happen in the future can influence what's happening right now or in the past. So it's like a weird time loop. It's different. It's a weird way of thinking. It's not it's hard to think about, honestly. Like, I don't know. I felt like I was going crazy sometimes, more than usual, studying this episode. 2011. Let's talk about 2011. This guy, Dr. Daryl Bem, he published a paper in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, and it outlined 9 experiments that indicated evidence for precognition. So this paper, it was called, if listeners are interested and they want to actually read it after we go through it, it was called Feeling the Future, Experimental Evidence for Anomalous Retroactive Influences on Cognition and Affect. Basically, the study ran 9 experiments and it had over 1,000 participants. And all the studies were statistically significant, except for maybe one, and we'll get into it when we go through it. But that's kind of fucking nuts. Like, I don't know. This is kind of what interested me in this topic. I kind of heard of this study, and then I was like interested in the precognition stuff. And I was like, why don't we go through this? But this particular paper, it's been cited over 1,300 times so far. So, like, just to put that in perspective, like in any field, if a scientific paper gets cited like 100 to 300 times, it's basically like a seminal paper for that field. Like, it's kind of like a game-changing like piece of that field. So anyone who's studying something, like, they're kind of expected to know that paper. At like 100 or 300 citations, that's like seminal. And this is like 1,300 plus.
Wow. Yeah.
So it's like widely cited, probably because it's like it breaks our understanding of everything, essentially. But anyways, like, that's just to give the listener an idea of like how popular this paper is. In 2011, this kind of like blew up science, because if precognition is a real thing, that would require retrocausation, which, as we've already talked about, is insane. Like, how can the future influence the present or the past? That doesn't really make sense, because time is supposed to be unidirectional. So it's like something deemed impossible in our current understanding of physics. So like science was like, this is wrong, this can't be right, there's got to be some kind of error. It doesn't really make sense. So like the results were highly scrutinized by the scientific community, and they still are highly scrutinized. Like, there's a lot of criticism on this paper, but there was so much criticism in 2011 on this that the journal's editors had to release an editorial alongside the paper explaining that they basically saying like, we know this is crazy as fuck, but we checked the data and it looks right. like they're like, this is peer reviewed. Like, we went through the data and like the data suggests this and we know it's crazy.
Yeah.
But we're not retracting this because there's nothing incorrect about the science here or like the analysis here. So that's not normal. Like, that doesn't ever happen. Like, that just goes to show how crazy this is. There's like an actual editorial to go along with it. Basically, just while we're in the basics still, this precognition paper by Dr. Daryl Bem, they released the materials and methods for the studies that they did in it, and it was available for other researchers to try replicate. And since then, and up to 2016, so since 2011 to 2016, there have been 90 experiments in 33 laboratories in 14 different countries that attempted to repeat Daryl Bem's studies. So there's a lot of people that were like, this is fucking nuts, let's try repeat this. So there was a meta-analysis done in 2016 looking at all these 90 experiments in different labs, like the results they had. And it's called Feeling the Future, a meta-analysis of 90 experiments on the anomalous anticipation of random future events. And this meta-analysis of these 90 experiments, it reported an overall effect size greater than 6 sigma, or Z equals 6.4, or a p-value of 1.2 times 10 raised to the negative 10. Now, that might not mean anything yet, but let me explain what this means statistically. This is fucking bananas. This is like unbelievably ridiculous statistics. So sigma refers to standard deviations from the mean of a normal distribution. So like, just picture a bell curve. And if you were like 1 sigma, that's 1 standard deviation away from the middle of the bell. And if you were 2 standard deviations away, that'd be 2 sigma, 3 sigma, etc. And basically, 3 sigma is already at the 0.1% tail ends of the normal distribution. So like, that's how far out you are from the center of the bell. Like, you're already, there's only 0.1% left, basically, to just say it in a nutshell. 5 sigma indicates about a 1 in a million chance that the findings could be a result of random variations. 6 sigma is about 1.5 billion that the findings are due to random variations. And they had 6.4. So like your standard deviations are like so far from the middle of this normal distribution. It's like, it's incredibly unlikely that this is due to some random chance. It's not like studies don't get this high. There's only like a few that get a 6 sigma. It's not like clinical trials don't even come fucking close to 6 sigma. Like this is nuts.
Yeah, I don't think I can recall any scientific experiment that goes up to their 6 sigma. No.
Yeah, it's crazy. So I also mentioned a Z score of 6.4 just to give listeners an idea of what that means. So a Z score of 3.5, that yields a confidence interval of 99.95% to 99.98%. And they had 6.4. So like even if they said, hey, our Z score is 3.5, that still means it's like a 0.05% chance only that it would be due to random chance, but they had a 6.4 in the meta-analysis. So very crazy statistics. The last thing I said, I mentioned that p-value. It was like 10 to the negative 10, just to give listeners what that means. So the threshold, this is like the most common value reported in like most of science, is a p-value. And usually it's 0.05. So that's like the threshold for accepting if a hypothesis is true or false. So like if your p-value was 0.5, you'd be like, oh, this is due to random chance. But if your p-value was 0.04, which is below 0.05, you'd be like, oh, okay, what we're observing, this is statistically significant. And what they had was a p-value of 0.0000000000012. So like, we're talking like many orders of magnitude below 0.05. Like this is, if you just had a 0.04, like that's good enough for science. They're like, oh yeah, that's good. I believe that. I'll believe that. This is like ridiculously below that.
Yeah, so everyone should believe that these experiments are due to the effect that they say they are instead of random chance.
Yes, instead of random chance. Yeah, that's right. Unless there's some kind of fuckery going on, it's just like, yeah, that you have like the effect is real according to this meta-analysis. I'm not saying that it is real. I'm just saying according to the meta-analysis, that's what you would conclude. This is another thing with the meta-analysis, just where we're throwing out numbers. They determined how many, because one of the biases you can get is like, oh, like you're just including studies that have been done. How do we know how many? What if there's people who did studies and they saw the opposite, and because they saw the opposite, they just didn't report it?
Yeah.
So like you're in your interpretation, you're just taking the studies that saw what they wanted, and they calculated how many studies there would have to be unreported for that to impact the value. And they determined that 544 additional unreported studies against the findings would need to be lurking out there to reduce the significance that they found. So this basically says that you can't just be like, oh, it's a selection bias, because like they actually calculated out what that would need to be. So it just seems like unlikely that there would be that selection bias. As I was saying, like this is like greatly exceeds the typical criterion value for decisive evidence in support of an experimental hypothesis.
Yeah. Can I offer like one of the criticisms?
Yeah.
Maybe not in the meta-analysis, but in the overall experiments that were conducted by Bem. Some have criticized the use of the p-values, are arguing that they are not appropriate for testing hypotheses about precognition or other paranormal phenomena. In particular, they've pointed out that the p-value does not provide evidence in favor of an alternative hypothesis, such as the existence of precognition, but only indicates the strength of the evidence against the null hypothesis, which is the absence of an effect. So maybe they're testing a few different alternatives. So that's why those stats are so high.
Yeah. So what you're saying is, and I mean, I actually agree with that 100%. It doesn't, that's the effect that anytime there's an experiment that's designed, you're trying to test something, right? And like what you were saying, you might have statistical evidence saying like, oh, So what I think is happening, I have statistical evidence for that. But what you think is happening, it could really just be something else that you didn't think of. So like there could be something that's outside of this retrocausation that's like, I don't know, you know, like clues to the participant in some unknown way, like something like that you just wouldn't know. And it's like, that's actually what you were testing, but you thought you were testing precognition, but you weren't. You were testing clues. You just didn't know you were testing clues, kind of thing.
Yeah, essentially.
So like there's 100%. I'm going kind of crazy here and kind of puffing everything up a fuckload on purpose, because I think, I don't know, I just like fringe science is fucking awesome, and a lot of weird crazy shit comes from the fringe, so I like looking into it. But at the same time, it's like, you have to, you know, be grounded, and it's like they could have been measuring something that they didn't think they were measuring.
And I think like that's where the issue lies in a lot of these like phenomena studies or paranormal type of studies, is because we don't necessarily understand them. It's just like anything that happens could be like significant or indicate that, you know, oh, this thing is happening, but in reality we just don't understand why something is happening, but we're just attributing it to, oh yeah, it's psi or clairaudience or whatever the experiment may be.
Yeah, or it's just, it could also be an error in the measurement, whatever you're using to measure. Like you might think the measurement, the way of measuring isn't influenced by like treatment A and treatment B, but like the measurement actually might be different in treatment A versus B. So it's like you think you're measuring the difference between the treatments, but really you're just measuring the difference on how the measurement changes. So it's like, that's another thing that could be a factor as well. But we can get into that. But I want to go through the study, and we can have listeners judge for themselves what they think is going on here. But that's what we're going to focus on. We're going to focus on Daryl Bem's studies, and it's pretty nuts. Like, this is pretty crazy shit. So before we get into it, I just want to mention a little bit about Dr. Daryl Bem, just to give listeners an idea of what type of person he is. So he was a Cornell University professor and formerly of Stanford University. So he has quite the pedigree of like prestige institutions behind him. He got a Bachelor of Arts, a BA, well, I guess that's what it is, in physics. Then he did graduate work at MIT, and then he did a PhD at the University of Michigan. Now, he taught at Carnegie Mellon University, Stanford, Harvard, and Cornell University. But he started at Cornell in 1978 and then retired in 2007, becoming a professor emeritus, gaining professor emeritus status at that time. Now, Bem, this is crazy. So he's not like your average professor. He's pretty fucking like epic. In 1973, he developed what's called the self-perception theory. And this paper has been cited 10,000 plus times. It's one of the most cited scientific papers of all time. Like, literally. So this guy is not like fucked. Like, he's not just like some quack. He is an established scientist. And not only that, like, his theories are like groundbreaking.
Yeah. Like
10,000 citations. Like I was saying, a seminal paper is like 100 to 300. He has a paper that's been cited 10,000 times. So like, that's like a game. That's like a paradigm shift in a field when that happens. It's it's crazy shit that like barely ever happens. And he's got,
celebrity within the research world, a superstar, a cash cow.
Yeah, exactly. So like when he's coming out talking about precognition, you know, he's like, oh, I have evidence for precognition. It's kind of like, oh shit, like this is, we should, like, I don't know, like, it's not like, it'd be different if it was like some random dude who's got like a handful of publications or something. It's like, no, this is fucking Daryl Bem. It's quite crazy. Okay, let's get into this. Before we continue the episode, if you're retroactively enjoying this podcast, the people you hang out with probably will too. Do us a solid and please pass on this episode to your social media friends on Facebook, Twitter, or other platforms. We would definitely appreciate your support. I'd also like to take this time to shout out some of our valued listeners. Huge, epic, massive shout out to Shiarder_ and Batcat Meatloaf on Instagram for leaving us 5-star reviews on Spotify. We're both champions among mere mortals. Also, shout out to M. Dillman, R. Freeman, Ghost, Nancy, Justin M, Jenny H, Robbie S, Dirt Metal Ranch, The Real Thick Nicky, Slickers Z _ West Coast Gypsies, Anne Marie 1971, Wicked 1714, Dan Max KP, The Morphinator, Lambert Press, Lil Miggy 04, Peepin' It, and Landonberry 5 for reaching out on Instagram or liking our stuff. We appreciate all of you. To everyone else, please feel free to submit your topic or drink recommendations at www.theswervepodcast.com. May good karma and vibes with all of you. Back to the show. So what we're going to do, we're going to go through these 9 experiments, and we're going to figure out what the hell is going on here. So the first part of the paper, they were kind of looking at like a retroactive approach and avoidance. So the first experiment that they did, they used erotic imagery, and they were trying to see like if they could do like measure like a psychological effect of approach. So like just to set this up, there's like evolutionary advantages. So they wanted to see if like the physiology can anticipate unpredictable erotic or negative stimuli before they occur, because they're trying to figure out a way like if like let's just assume precognition is a thing, why might it be a thing? So they're like, oh, evolutionarily, if somehow there's like it could be an evolutionary advantage for reproduction if you could know that an erotic stimuli was in the future or something and like alter your behavior to go towards it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Kind of?
Yeah. I guess it does.
Yeah. So to explain like what's going on here, they use a set of forced choice experiments, they're called. So this will make more sense when I explain how they set it up, what I'm talking about. In the first study, they used 100 students. There were 50 of them were male, 50 of them were female. And before they conducted the experiment, they were given a 3-minute relaxation period. So they had to like look at stars and like listen to like new age bullshit for 3 minutes and just like kind of calm down and relax. And then on a computer, pictures of 2 curtains appeared side by side. One has a picture behind it and the other had nothing. So their task was to click on the curtain that they felt had the picture behind it. And then the curtain would open and it would reveal if it was correct. And they did this 36 times. So they did 36 trials per participant. And then each session gave a 50% random intermix of erotic images. So like sex scenes, I don't know, like, you know, just like I don't know, like porn basically.
Yeah.
Or non-erotic images. So just like a table, right?
Yeah.
And their idea was if precognition is real, they should statistically more likely pick the erotic images, not knowing they were there, kind of thing. Because if you're trying to put an evolutionary advantage to it, one evolutionary advantage would be like, hey, maybe if I take this path, I'll reproduce instead of this path. So something from the future tells me I need to go this way, and you go that way, and it's like, oh shit,
yeah.
I can fuck here. And then you reproduce and your genes go on to the next generation, where if you went the other way, it wouldn't have happened. So this is like, they're kind of making like a way to measure that.
When I read that, I immediately just thought like Daryl Bem was just like flashing pictures of his dick to the participants.
It's just his dick.
It's like, what'd you think of that? Huh? Pretty nice size. I don't know. That's like immediately what I thought. It's just like, which one has the picture of my dick behind the curtain? And they're like, this one. And it's just like always right because he programmed it that way. Like, look at that. You must desire me a lot.
Yeah.
Your future is telling me this is what you need. So here's my number.
Yeah. It's just, oh God. So from the participants' point of view, that they thought they were kind of like they were testing clairvoyance or something, right? Because they have to pick a curtain and they're like, oh, can I pick it right? But really what's going on, so the participants were told that a picture was hidden behind one of the curtains, and their challenge is to guess correctly which curtain had the concealed picture. But the trick to this was neither the picture itself nor its left-right position was determined until after the participant recorded their guess. So this made the procedure a test of detecting a future event, or in other words, a test of precognition. Right? So they assume that there's a picture behind the curtains and they're trying to pick the right one. But in reality, there's nothing behind that. There's nothing behind the curtains. So they pick, and then randomly, there's like a random number generator, which they do explain how they do this, put something there. And the idea is you are statistically more likely to pick the right one, even though it wasn't there because of precognition. Does that make sense? Kind of?
It does make sense, but it doesn't make sense of how like you could get any conclusion from that. Because essentially you're being random and picking it. The random number or random picture generator is being random and like assigning which curtain has the picture. So it's just like I don't know. There's too many randomness in it.
Well, this is what you are measuring, because the only thing, if you put precognition on the table, the only thing random that's occurring is the random number generator. Your guess, because it's being influenced by the future, is not actually random. So you think you're being random, but you're not.
Okay.
You chose the erotic image. So it's weird to think about. It's not unidirectional time, man. It's different. So here's the result. So participants, they predicted which curtain would have randomly been assigned erotic images more than chance. So more than 50% of the time, they were guessing correctly. They were picking the right fucking curtain, even though they didn't know what would be behind the curtain. And no one knew what would be behind the curtain because it was done with a fucking random number generator thing. I have a crazy note here I put. So they repeated this exact experiment that I just outlined, but instead of using humans to choose the curtain. So this is crazy too. So instead of like a human picking the curtain and then the random number generator assigning where the image is going to go, they used random number generators to pick the curtain and then randomly assign where the image would go, and the effect was lost. So what that means, there's something about being a fucking conscious human that's responsible for predicting the correct placement of the images. You can't just do it with a machine. It's like the human has to be there to see the effect. And that blew my fucking mind.
Would that kind of indicate that me as a participant is using precognition maybe through the researcher to get like even more clues, I guess, in picking the right image? So you're kind of working together with another person's consciousness.
In this case, no, because how they designed the study, the participant and the researcher had no way of knowing. Both of them they wouldn't know what was behind it.
Okay.
So in this case, I don't think so, because as far as I'm aware, yeah, but neither of them knew what would have been placed there. The only thing that knew per se would be, I guess, the random number generator when it picked it, because the analysis is done in post. So
okay.
Like you wouldn't know until you actually like looked at the data. But that's crazy. So like somehow, because it's not like there's something behind it and you're like, it's testing like telepathy or like clairvoyance, like, or remote viewing or some shit. Like I can see what's behind the curtain, so I'm going to guess correctly more likely. There's nothing there. And they're guessing. And then a random event assigns the picture to either where they guessed or not. But more often than not, it's assigned to where they guessed. So it's a retrocausation.
Okay. I think I'm getting it.
So I want to move on to experiment 2. Very similar. As we said, they're like, okay, maybe there's some kind of evolutionary advantage to precognition. If it is a thing, maybe there's an advantage to it. So another way to look at this is to look at avoidance. So picture like before it was like a stimulus desired, so like sex, because that leads to reproduction. Here they're showing a negative stimulus, something that you would be scared of because that would hinder your survival. Like think of like snakes or like, I don't know, toxic spiders, shit like that. That's what they're doing in experiment 2. So they had 150 participants, 107 women, 43 men. And on each trial of the experiment, they were shown a picture and its mirror image side by side and asked to indicate which image is liked better. So basically, they're being asked to express a preference. Then the computer it would flash a masked picture on the screen, and then the person would pick a target, and then a random number generator would pick the target. So it's kind of the same, but a little bit different. So if the target was the same, they would get a subliminal flash of a positive image. And if the target was not the same, they would get a subliminal flash of a negative image. And basically, participants significantly pressed the target over the non-target. So this indicated there was some kind of psi behavior or precognition going on. So I understand I said a lot of shit there, but basically they were like stimulus seekers, even though the random number generator picked after them. Does that make? I don't know if that makes sense. This one's kind of strange too.
Yeah, it would. But is there like a difference between positive image? Like if you keep getting positive images, like you're more likely to keep guessing the right target rather than, or would it just be like either positive or negative? The more times you get it, the more times like you're likely to get it again.
I think in this case, that was what was happening. So if I'm understanding how they did this, if the target was the same, they would get flashed the positive image. And it's like a subliminal flash. I should say that. It's a subliminal flash. So how they would do this in this experiment, I guess this is like known in just like psychological studies. There's a certain amount of milliseconds where you can't perceive like consciously what was shown to you.
Yeah.
So they would flash up the positive image, and if the target was the same, it seemed like they would pick that more often than the negative one. So it's like they're avoiding the negative one and going to the positive one.
Okay.
So I think what you were saying, it's like that's what they were seeing. It's just set up differently. It's not like curtains here. They're like shown an image and they're like, which one do you like better? And then it doesn't matter because it's a fucking mirror image. But when they pick, then they're shown a flash of positive or negative. And I think that's what matters.
Okay.
But they don't know that they're seeing that because it's subliminal. And it appears that they're avoiding the negative image, even though it's shown after they've already picked their target. So it doesn't make sense unless retrocausation is a thing.
Okay.
Yeah, they significantly press the target over the non-target. It doesn't really make sense. I don't know. Do these make sense or weird? And I just fucking lose everyone, you think? I don't know.
It takes a while to kind of get them, but it makes sense. It just takes a while for you to understand how they're supposed to be measuring precognition in each of these experiments. Because the thought of it is just like so confusing in itself. Like the future is, the future is holding, so that's why you're making these choices.
The thing is, you would expect this to not have an effect at all. Like you're just picking something at random and then you're shown positive or negative. So like if you're just picking something at random, it should just be 50-50. Like it either is the target or it's not the target.
Yeah.
But for some reason, they're seeking the stimulus, it appears like. And the only way that would make sense is if there's retrocausation. Because how can you pick the thing? How can you seek the stimulus if you didn't even know it was there in the first place? You only know it's there after. Like you don't even know it. It's a subliminal in this one. But they're seeking it somehow. So that's experiment 1 and 2 in a nutshell. Number 1, it's like the erotic imagery. It's like they seem to want that. And in the negative experiment 2, they're avoiding the negative image, kind of seeking the positive one. Let's talk about experiment 3, retroactive priming. This is a weird one. This is going to take a second. It's priming experiments. This is this is what they say. In a typical effective priming experiment, participants are asked to judge as quickly as they can whether a picture is pleasant or unpleasant, and their response time is measured. Just before the picture appears, a positive or negative word, for example, beautiful or ugly, is flashed briefly on the screen. This word is called a prime. That makes sense? So they have to say if something's pleasant or unpleasant, but they're flashed the prime before they see it and they have to pick. That's like normally how it would be done. You get like flash the prime. So like individuals, they typically respond more quickly when the valences of the prime and the picture are congruent. So if both are positive or both are negative, than when they are incongruent. So if they're judging something as pleasant and the prime is beautiful, they're more likely to judge it pleasant. You know what I'm saying? Or if the prime is ugly, they're more likely to say it's unpleasant. And that's just like an established thing in the social science literature. That's kind of what they're talking about here. But what he wants to do, he wants to show them the prime retroactively. Does that make sense? So that's the difference here. Like basically, so they're taking an established priming experiment where they know usually the prime and the picture are congruent. That's just like known in social science. And they're like, okay, well, what if we show the prime retroactively? So rather than showing it before, let's show it after the participants make their judgment. So now the participants are like, they say it's pleasant, and then after the word is shown. So it's like they've already made their decision. It's not before. So it shouldn't influence anything.
Yeah.
But it did.
Are these primes being shown subliminally as well, or is there enough time to?
In this case, it's not subliminal. It's just like, it's brief, but you would be able to read it. So yeah, basically they wanted to see if a congruent retroactive prime also produced faster responses than incongruent primes. Because what they're measuring here is time. It's so again, they have 100 participants, 69 women, 31 men, and they're asked to press a button if a picture is pleasant or unpleasant, and then the response time is measured, and then a word is flashed on the screen after they press the button, and it's randomly either congruent or incongruent. So basically what we're saying is if the picture is pleasant, the word being flashed, it's either it will be like beautiful or it would say ugly. It would be something congruent with the pleasant or incongruent, and that's random. That's the random part. Now, participants were 15 milliseconds faster on congruent trials than incongruent trials. Again, evidence of precognition, retrocausation. Because they're showing it after. It's not before they pick, like you would typically do with this experiment. It's after. So it should have no effect, but it did.
Yeah, this one makes more sense in terms of the method used. Like this one, it kind of is easier to indicate, okay, there's precognition going on or not. So
I think it's probably my fault though for experiment 1 and 2. Because like they're measuring the same kind of shit. It's just different. But yeah, this one I think, this one is a little bit easier because there's like a comparison for like how it should be and what they changed.
Yeah.
They just did it after instead of before. But the other thing's doing this, everything's done after as well. It's just slightly different approach. So that's crazy. I don't know. So now you're starting to get it. Now you're starting to. We'll see where you're at.
It only took 3 experiments, but yeah.
Experiment 4. This is a retroactive priming experiment as well. So they repeated the same thing that I just described in experiment 3, but they used a fixed positive prime and a fixed negative prime. So remember in the previous one, I guess it was like a random thing, but now it's like it's going to be this or this. And they had the same finding as experiment 3. So participants were 27.4 milliseconds faster on congruent trials than incongruent trials again. So put another way, participants will say an image is pleasant faster if after they already picked pleasant, a congruent word is shown. That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, it shouldn't make any sense, but it does.
It's retrocausation.
Yeah.
Like this makes sense. This experiment makes sense if you do it, if you show them the prime before, because the prime will influence, right? The prime should affect whether you pick pleasant or unpleasant, like the term on the time, on the measurement of time. Remember, is if it's congruent, you're faster if it's a pleasant image. But if it was incongruent and it's a pleasant image, you'll be slower, like it kind of fucks with you.
Yeah.
But here they're doing it after. So like the effect is, it's like applying it backwards through time. backwards time. Right? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that's what it suggests. So
That's what it suggests. Is statistically significant.
So knowing that you're going to get the word beautiful, you're quicker in choosing a pleasant image when shown.
Yeah. So I don't, these ones are quite peculiar. So let's get into another approach they used. So we're going to talk a little bit about habituation. This might be more confusing than experiment 1 and 2. This is experiment 5. They're doing retroactive habituation. So habituation is like a known thing in social science. So let's talk a little bit about it. Habituation, it's when individuals first see a strong stimulus, they have a strong physiological response to it, but on repeated exposure, the physiological response diminishes. The way I like to think about it, if you spook me with a scary ghost, you might scare the shit out of me. But then you do it 10 seconds after you already did it, I'm probably going to be okay. And then you do it 10 seconds after that, I'm probably going to be even more okay. And you know what I'm saying? Like,
yeah,
it's just like it kind of dampens the physiological response, but that occurs for a lot of things. It's not just, but that's like how I like to think about it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
So the habituation, this is what they're looking at. Now, there's another weird thing. This is another effect that's known. It's called the mirror exposure effect. And mirror, it sounds like I'm saying like a reflective surface, but I'm not. I'm saying MERE. So like it's just a mirror cat, or I don't know, like it's like small, like mirror exposure effect.
Mere coincidence or whatever.
Yeah. So basically what this means is across a wide range of contexts, the more frequently humans or other animals are exposed to a particular stimulus, the more they come to like it. So this is true. Like the way I like to think about this one is in just like relationships. It's like you might not really like someone, but like over time, you're like, fuck, I guess you're kind of cool. You know what I mean? Like that's how I remember this one.
Yeah, tale as old as time, the friend zone. You stay in there long enough, you'll get out eventually.
Has that worked for anyone ever once?
In movies, it has. So I'd like to think it's worked in person, in real life.
It's like
but
some
you gotta
retroactive.
Just like keep telling them like, hey, I want to be out of the friend zone. And over time,
you will like me in the future.
Yeah.
You will like me.
Yeah.
Like retroactively, it just like.
Or even like dating apps. If you're on every dating app and they see your profile on one, they'll swipe left. See it on another, they'll swipe left. But if you're on all of them and like she comes across your profile enough times, she's gonna swipe right eventually. So there you go, fellas.
The Swerve podcast. The mirror exposure effect. That's right. So there, you should be on all the platforms. Every single one.
Just like we're on all the platforms
Maximize.
For podcasts.
Yeah, that's kind of what we did with the podcast. We kind of just keep showing up everywhere all the time.
Even when Reddit doesn't want us to.
And it's actually true. We do. Yeah, exactly. I remember on Set even some people are like, like there's like 500 people that use this. And, we get all this shit all the time. But then like one guy's like, I'm going to listen finally.
Yeah.
And he listened. And now he likes the podcast.
Marketing.
The mirror exposure effect. Okay, that's fucking funny. Okay, so we're talking about habituation and the mirror exposure effect. My point is we just need to know what those terms mean. Otherwise, we won't understand the experiment. Though, as the number of exposures increases in a mirror exposure experiment, liking increases, it plateaus and eventually begins to decline. The reason being boredom, it overtakes habituation. So this is why it's weird. Because we were just saying like the more you're exposed to something, the more you like it. It's like that's true up to a point, but then you hit a plateau and you eventually begin to decline. So everything we just said, that's the ultimate demise of the podcast.
Damn.
Because boredom takes over. So anyways, let's get into the experiment they did. We just need to keep those in our minds. So 100 participants, 63 women, 33 men. they're shown a pair of negative pictures. So they're first shown the two pictures side by side, and then asked to indicate which one they like better. So again, they're showing a preference, and then they're asked to watch passively as those pictures are flashed rapidly on the screen. And most of the pictures range from very pleasant to mildly unpleasant, and some of the pictures contain very unpleasant images. I guess those were like important controls for the study. And they used a similar setup as mere exposure experiments, but they did it backwards to assess retroactivity. So again, like I was explaining in experiment 3 and 4, they typically do it one way, but they're doing it retroactively. This is what they're doing here. So a typical mere exposure experiment, first, the participant is repeatedly exposed subliminally to a picture. This picture is called the habituation target. So remember, this is subliminal here. So they know the exact time. They've just established this in the science. Like you see the photo, but you don't know you saw it. 2, the participant is then shown two pictures side by side and asked to indicate which one they like better. And one of the pictures is the target, and the other is a closely matched picture that the participant has not seen before. If the participant prefers the target, the trial is scored as a hit. The hit rate expected by chance is thus 50%. So how this works, typically people will habituate to the negative image unknowingly, and they pick the target. Does that make sense? Weird experiment, but like if we go by habituation, the more you're exposed to something, the less it affects you. So like as you're going through this experiment, it's like you're going to more likely pick the target because like you habituate to the negative image. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That's how they normally do this. That's how
Mhm.
they normally would do this. But in experiment 5 here, what we're talking about, they reverse step 1 and 2. So like how it's normally done, in step 1, they're exposed repeatedly to the subliminal picture. And then in step 2, they're shown which image they prefer, and it's like which one. But in experiment 5, you're doing step 2 first. So they're shown pictures, and they're like, which one do you prefer? And then after they make their choice, then they're shown the subliminal picture. So they just reverse the order. So after picking their preference, the random number generator would randomly assign one of the images as the habituation target and then subliminally flash the image. So you would hypothesize that participants would pick the target greater than chance for what was subliminally flashed to them. And this is what happened, and it was statistically significant. So on trial, I think another way to put this, on trials with negative picture pairs, participants preferred the target significantly more than the non-target. So the experiment worked, because they know people have done this habituation mere exposure shit, and that's how they do the experiment. And they're like, well, let's just reverse the order, and it still worked.
Interesting. Yeah.
So retrocausation, backwards time. That one's really fucking confusing, like straight up. But let's talk about experiment 6 quick. This is a quick one because it's the same kind of shit. It's a retroactive habituation experiment as well. This time they had 150 participants, 87 women, 63 men. The replication, this replication added erotic picture pairs, and you would hypothesize the opposite as above. This is also confusing, but we'll go through it. People would habituate to the target they were shown, so it would be less enticing. It's before they were showing negative images, but now they're showing like images you want, so it should be less enticing, not more, because you're avoiding it. So on trials with erotic pairs, participants preferred the target significantly less frequently than the non-target, which is what they expected. So basically they did it with negative and positive, and it was the same result. That's all that this is.
Okay.
So they covered their bases. Experiment 7. This is related to what we were talking about with habituation and the mere exposure. It's called a retroactive induction of boredom. This one is funny to me. So they hypothesized that those high in boredom proneness would show significantly decreased liking for the target. And recall, because like we talked about before, eventually boredom will overwhelm habituation. Like you'll just get bored. And in this one, they had 200 participants, 140 women, 60 men. They used the same method, but images flashed this time were not subliminal. They're called supraliminal. So they're shown quick, but it's noticeable. That's the only difference that was done here. And Daryl Bem thought that this would make people bored easier because like they're actually seeing it. And boredom is needed for this experiment because that's what they're trying to test. So he's like, oh, we'll just make it supraliminal instead of subliminal. But he does say he regretted changing that variable because it didn't actually make it more boring. So like he thinks it fucked his experiment. And if you recall in the basics, I was saying 8 of the 9 experiments were significant. This one was not.
Okay.
And he blames it because he's like, oh, I changed the variables. But anyways, so they did not have significant results here. But for those high in boredom proneness, the retroactive boredom induction was significant. So if they like, instead of taking their whole sample size, if they only took the sample size of people that are known to be high, they get bored very easily. It was for those people. But like for the general target, it wasn't. So like he was kind of right, but not.
Yeah, I guess. And it's just because they were showing the images longer. So maybe just an additional stimuli that you actually pick up on that changes the behavior in the experiment.
Yeah, that's what he said. But basically, like, it's funny because like for those people high in boredom proneness, that it was significant for them. So what that means is people can be made to be bored retroactively. So it's like you're bored right now because the person in the future that you will be is bored as fuck. So you're just like, I'm bored. But like you're not bored, you're just retroactively bored. I just find that so funny. It's so stupid.
Yeah.
I'm not actually bored, I'm retroactively bored. I'm not trying to be.
It's future you sending you a message, and the message that they're sending is, hey, you're bored. So like out of all the messages you can send from the future, is just like, yo, check your watch right now, you're fucking bored.
Well, it's like being at like a social event or like some kind of party and you're just like, meh, arms crossed, like being a fucking bitch and just, man, this sucks. This really sucks. And everyone's having a really great time and it's awesome. And like someone comes up to you and they're like, why do you look like you don't want to be here? And you'd be like, just give this party 5 more minutes and you won't want to be here either. And then like some event happens and he's like, I fucking told you. I was retroactively bored. Like everybody else gets bored because some stupid shit happens or like, you know what I mean? Like it's so strange.
Yeah, we call those people buzzkills.
But they just see the future.
Yeah.
They just know. So anyways, that one was kind of weird. That's 7. Let's get into 8. This is retroactive facilitation of recall. So memory, retroactive. So the current experiment tests the hypothesis that memory can work both ways in time by testing whether rehearsing a set of words makes them easier to recall, even if the rehearsal takes place after the recall test is given. This is an easier one to understand. Basically, so let's go. This is like the priming experiments. It's just conceptually easy. So they had 100 participants here, 64 women, 36 men. Participants were not told in advance about the recall test. Participants were given a set of words and given a free recall test of words. So specifically, they were given 48 common nouns. These nouns were from categories of food, animal, occupation, and clothing. And they were shown these for 3 seconds. And then they were asked to visualize the word in their head. And at the end, they were given a surprise recall test. So they didn't know this was going to happen. And they were asked to recall as many words in any order as possible. Then they were given 6 randomly selected words as practice words from all 4 of those categories. So there's 24 words total. And then the other 24 words would be unpracticed as controls. So then after that, they had to type and retype the 6 words 4 times. And this was like their practice after the recall test. And the hypothesis here was that participants would recall more of the to be practiced words than the unpracticed words. So basically what they're doing, you're showing some words, you're told to memorize it, you're given a test. Normally, you would study before the test. You'd be like, you'd get the words and you'd like study the words and you'd be like, then you'd be given the recall test and it's like, how many words did you remember? This time they were just shown the words, given the test, and they just remembered what they could remember. But then after the test, it's like they're studying the words. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah.
It's like a spelling test kind of, but like you don't get to study beforehand, you get to study after.
Okay.
And guess what happened? The results showed significantly that practicing a set of words after the recall test does, in fact, reach back in time to facilitate the recall of those words. So because they studied it in the future, the people who studied in the future in their tests, they actually did better on that the surprise recall test than those that didn't practice. Like the words that were practiced, they recalled better than the words that were unpracticed for the same fucking person. What's going on? So if you study in the future, you do better on a test. Is that why you did good on the test? Because in the future you studied?
So yeah, first fail the test and then study, and then you'll know exactly, what you need to.
But that would you'd have to what you'd need to do is go into a test being, I know nothing about this test, but I have an alarm reminder for a week from now where no matter what happens on this planet, I will study for 8 hours. You might actually do well on that test.
Interesting. Okay. Should have used that in my college days.
Yeah, but you know what I'm saying? It just doesn't make any fucking sense. So experiment 8 is crazy. Basically, if you study in the future, it can impact how you recall in the past. Let's get into number 9 here before we roll out of some of this. This was retroactive facilitation of recall. Same as experiment 8, but they used a new practice method to enhance the recall. Here they had 50 participants, 34 women, 16 men, and basically all they did, they just did a better studying thing than they did in experiment 8. And the retroactive recall effect was even stronger than before, and it was significant. So they enhanced their effect. So the more study, the better studying that they did, it actually increased the effect. They were able to recall the words better. I don't know what's going on here. That's crazy. So let's get into some explanations here. Basically, we kind of teased at this as we were going through, but there's an evolutionary explanation for precognition, and that is that it's just acquired through evolution by conferring a survival and reproductive advantage on the species. So precognitive sensing of danger, that would give you a survival advantage. So maybe that's why this is happening. But also precognitive sensing of sexual opportunity would confer a reproductive advantage. So if precognition is a thing, one explanation for why it's a thing, it could just be straight up evolutionary selective pressures. And that goes back to experiment 1 and 2. That's kind of what they were testing there. So it would kind of corroborate that idea. There's a physiological explanation. So this guy, Eisnick, in 1966, he speculated that psi might be a primitive form of perception that preceded cortical development. So he thinks, you have the reptile brain. It's and then you have the the idea is all the shit that controls your heart rate and your lung is kind of the core of the brain, how you breathe and it's the core. But then we have our cortex around it, and that's how we think about shit and we actually execute executive function and stuff. So he thinks the cortex suppressed the initial part of the brain that had psi. And one of the ideas is that extroverts, they're known to be better on psi tests than introverts. And interestingly, extroverts also have lower cortical arousal than introverts. So this is just physiologically, maybe there's just the people who have precognition, they just have less cortex.
Yeah. That is interesting because when you study animals or whatever, before like a natural disaster, or before, you know how they have like those dogs that like detect seizures before they happen. It's just, maybe there is something to it where like the smaller their cortex, the psi is greater, so they're able to sense these things before they happen. Like even with the earthquakes in Turkey and stuff, before the earthquakes hit, there was like wild dogs like barking and like trying to warn people, and then like the earthquakes hit. But even like, I know my dad would tell me, is like, if something doesn't feel right, like you think there's going to be like a tornado or some like natural disaster, just look to the animals, because they'll already be like preparing for it. So they're like herding together or just like running away from an area, and just because they know something's about to happen. And maybe because we've developed such a like a bigger cortex, we suppress that core ability. So maybe there's something to it.
That's a good take. Yeah. So like dogs are like master retroactive precognition beings.
Yeah. I mean, they can tell something's going to happen, but they can't communicate it. So they just bark. Or like with the seizure ones, they'll like tap the owner, making sure like they get down on the floor. And then like a couple seconds later, the seizure happens. I don't know. It's pretty crazy.
Interesting. Okay. Fuck yeah. Quantum dogs. No, my next note. It's just quantum shit. This is like a classic explanation for absolutely everything. Some people are like, oh, it's entangled particles. So basically, we've talked about entangled particles and shit before. Even when they are later separated by arbitrarily large distances, an observation made on one of the entangled particles will simultaneously affect what will be observed on its entangled partner in ways that are incompatible with any physically permissible causal mechanism. So like some people are just like, oh, it's quantum shit. And that's why. Trying to explain how the retrocausation might. I have a quote from Daryl Bem, actually. So this is on believing in possible things, because this is crazy, and it was a quite, these findings are quite incredible. This is what Daryl Bem had to say about all of this. He said the following, quote,
"Near the end of her encounter, the White Queen, Alice, protests that one can't believe in possible things, a sentiment with which the 34% of academic psychologists who consider psi to be impossible would surely agree. The White Queen famously retorted, 'I dare say you haven't had much practice. When I was your age, I always did it for half an hour a day. Why, sometimes I believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast.' Unlike the White Queen, I do not advocate believing impossible things, but perhaps this article will prompt the other 66% of academic psychologists to raise their posterior probabilities of believing at least one anomalous thing before breakfast."
End quote. I just thought it's just a great quote. It's a great quote. Do you want to hop into final thoughts?
Yeah, let's do it.
So I have a couple things here that I noted to myself beforehand. But Izzo, do you want to maybe you
Did
start
you
us
note
off
these
here?
things retrospectively, or?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I have no way of knowing. I might have. Right?
Yeah.
Everything I'm doing every time could be a retroactive causation. You would not know.
Yeah, that's true.
Fuck.
Need a
That's why
drink
I'm
for that
drinking
one.
wine out of the bottle. It's just like my future self just like knows that like the bioelectricity topic. You can just like, oh, they're gonna grow livers in the future. Don't worry about it. So like my present self just drinks from the bottle on a podcast. Yeah, that's why.
Or that you need to be really drunk for the Patreon episode that we record next. So you're like, I got to do this now.
There's no externalities in the future. Live in the now. Like, that's why. I don't know. What do you think about this? Like, we went through these 9 experiments. Granted, my explanation of them probably obfuscated the results for some of them, but for some of them were easy to understand.
Yeah.
And like, what do you think? Like, it's pretty wild.
The experiments themselves, like, they're unexpected, but like the issue that I'm having is like relating it to the real world, just because like these happened in an experiment format. Like, they knew when they were setting up this experiment, it's like, okay, this is going to indicate that, you know, precognition is a thing. So maybe they set up a method where, you know, they can prove these things. I just really want to know like how it would relate to like a real life event. Like I did it with the dog thing, or like just animals, like observing them. But if there was a way to like accurately get humans to kind of prove that they know what's going to happen in the future, I don't know. But the experiments themselves are cool, like especially with the statistical analysis that they did. It means it's not just chance. There is something that is occurring. Maybe we're just unlocking that psi in our core brain that allows us to get these things.
Yeah, I know what you're saying. I will say though, like, one thing that I liked about their approach was they used studies that are like established methods for looking at some kind of psychological phenomenon, and they just reversed it.
Yeah.
So like, you know what I mean? Like the whole, like the field of habituation, that's like a common experiment or like a well-known experiment. And they're like, let's just reverse it. That's kind of what they, you know what I mean? So it's like, if we discredit what they did here, you kind of have to discredit the whole field of other shit.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because if we're like, oh, it was just an experimental setting, it's like, well, so was everything. So that's why I like what he was doing. Cause he's just like, let's just reverse it. And it like worked.
He was playing Uno one night and he's like, wait a minute. What if we just reverse everything that anyone's ever done?
It's a great question because it's one of those things you would never think to do. And he's just like, let's do it.
Yeah.
I actually have that actually is a good segue. I have an explanation for why he did that. At least one I think. I think the retrocausation inklings in Daryl Bem's mind. Do you remember when I was talking about the self-perception theory he came up with? It was like cited 10,000 times. And it's like very, very big in the field. So this was kind of thinking backwards, this theory that he proposed. So like normally we would assume that belief is foundational and like your behavior emerges from your belief. So we think the belief causes the behavior. So an example of this, think of someone who believes in working hard. They're like, I work hard, I'm a hard worker. We think that that belief causes them to have the behavior of working 20 extra hours a week. We're like, oh, you believe in work ethic. So like you put more hours in.
Yeah.
But the self-perception theory actually reverses that. And this was Daryl Bem's theory. He was like, he says, it's not the belief that causes the behavior. It's the behavior that causes the belief. So someone who has the behavior of working 20 hours extra per week, that's going to cause them to have belief in work ethic. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I see.
So it's not belief that causes the behavior. It's actually like, oh, if I just do this behavior, I will have that belief. And that was the self-perception theory. And that was huge. That like flipped at the time, you know, his field like on its head. And to me, that's like very the same thing. It's like, oh, well, like what if we just reverse it? And it worked. So it's quite crazy. So I had a little excerpt from something he wrote in 1973. This was from his self-perception theory. It was in Advances in Experimental Social Psychology while he was at Stanford. And this is like an introduction, just like a quick little thing that he had. It said, quote, individuals come to know their own attitudes, emotions, and other internal states partially by inferring them from observations of their own overt behavior and or the circumstances in which this behavior occurs. Thus, to the extent that internal cues are weak, ambiguous, or uninterpretable, the individual is functionally in the same position as an outside observer. an observer who must necessarily rely upon those same external cues to infer the individual's inner states. End quote. I love that. I love that. That's perfect because it means because it means you're in control. Essentially, at the end of the day, like if you want a certain value, you just need to go do that value. And in the same way, like you look at someone who's working 20 hours a week, like, oh, fuck, that person works hard. Well, that person believes they work hard. And it's the same shit. It's like it puts you in control. And I really like that. It has nothing to do with the precognition shit. But this guy's a fucking genius. And it's there's retroactive dogs. And yeah,
That's a good hook. They always say, like in the intro, make sure you have a good hook to kind of hook the reader in. And that's exactly what he did here.
So it's cool. I have a couple other things. I did come across some replication issues, which we didn't put into the main topic because it would have just been too much time. We talked about the meta-analysis from 2011 to 2016 and like the radical statistics they had on all the people that seemed to replicate what he was doing. So I'm not going to say what he did hasn't been replicated because it has. There's been 90 fucking experiments done. But in 2023, I did come across a paper. It was called, quote, Raising the Value of Research Studies in Psychological Science by Increasing the Credibility of Research Reports, the Transparent Psi Project, end quote. So they tried to replicate experiment 1, so just one experiment, and they couldn't get results different from chance. So I will say like there was an issue with that one. In 2022, again, the future failed no evidence for precognition in a large-scale replication attempt of Bem. This was another study. They tried to replicate 3 experiments from those 9 that we talked about. These were the retroactive recall and retroactive habituation experiments, and they could not replicate the findings. So there are studies out there that couldn't do what he did based on his methods. We talked about the meta-analysis, which that blows my fucking mind. A p-value of 10 to the negative 10, insane. Sigma 6, insane. But I will say, Bem is actually the first author on that meta-analysis. So it's just like, to me, it's like, is it a conflict of interest? Like, it could be. It could be. It's something to consider. Like, people, these things happen. But in defense of that conflict of interest, Bem didn't actually do the meta-analysis. This guy, P. Tresoli, did. So Bem just kind of wrote the paper where the other guy actually did the actual meta-analysis. That's just another thing to point out. He was on that paper, so it's a conflict of interest, in my opinion.
Yeah.
I don't know. At the end of the day, though, I'm, we didn't know this is as crazy as thinking the sun is at the center of the solar system. It's as crazy as that. It's as crazy as thinking like germ theory. People were like, you're fucking nuts. You have to wash your hands before surgery. Fuck you. And they didn't. They fucking didn't. It's the same thing. It's like, you think there's microscopic organisms, you fucking retard. It's like...
Yeah, we've come across a few topics that are like that are kind of changing the way we perceive the world. And unfortunately, we won't get Bem's perspective anymore because he did pass away on July 3rd, 2021. So,
did I know that? I don't think I knew that.
I don't know.
I'm retroactively sad. That's why I was so sad during this episode. But I don't know. If I were to sum up, I'm in. I buy it. Let's go. Fuck you, science.
I think I kind of convinced myself with the whole animals knowing stuff before it happens thing. Otherwise, like I was kind of in the skeptic boat. I think there's a chance for it. And we aren't there yet. But there must be a reason why animals have it and we don't. So
psychic dogs convinced you. Hell yeah. Yeah. Let's go. Let's go retroactive causation. Let's do it. So I don't know. We could roll out of it. I don't know. I don't have anything else to say. Let's go. Retroactively. That's what we should do for this episode. We should just have the rollout at the beginning, confuse the fuck out of everyone. I don't know.
Maybe that'll save them from listening to the episode. If they just hear the outro, they'll be like, "Oh, I already know what they were talking about. I don't need to listen."
Hey, that's something that they should. Oh, they already did. Never mind. Anyways, shout out to Sidestepping the Sun, a Canadian rock band that made the intro and outro music to the podcast. As always, again, shout out to El Yucateco Hot Sauce, still unofficial sponsor of the podcast, but we're getting close. We're getting there. I just love the hot sauce. I like spicy food, and I think if you're a listener who likes spicy food, you'll love El Yucateco Hot Sauce because they're the king of flavor. They flavored up your food. There's no calories, so you can flavor up food and it can still taste good, and you can still maintain a cut or whatever you're trying to do. You can be healthy and eat El Yucateco. What else can you do with it? I should say it's habanero based, so it's not like your basic, ketchup shit that you get from, I don't know, just various sources. It's just good. El Yucateco, try it out. Let us know what you think. If you like it, reach out to them on our behalf. Be like, hey, Swerve Podcast sent me to El Yucateco and I enjoyed it. We'd appreciate that. Izzo, what else do we have to say about social?
I'll mention our Patreon once again. So if you've enjoyed this episode and maybe you've listened to all the free episodes, maybe it's time to join the Patreon. So patreon.com/the Swerve Podcast. There you will find 2 tiers, a $1 Ride the Wave tier, and that'll give you access to the bonus episodes that we release each month and the library that we've released so far. You'll also get shout outs on the podcast. And then for $3 a month, you can join the Slap the Ass tier, and that'll give you all of the above, but you will also get every episode, both the main and the Patreon, a few days before anyone else. So you'll receive them on Sundays rather than the typical drop time of Wednesdays.
Hell yeah. Lastly, I'm retroactively forgetting what we do here.
I mean, there's other ways to support us, of course. But also we do appreciate just interactions on social media. We're trying to grow this podcast. So one way is to, share it out to your social media friends. If you have any questions or want to reach out to us, you can do that on our DMs, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, whatever you use. But we'd also recommend that you check out our website. So it was newly launched. It's theswervepodcast.com. And there you'll also find a form that you can fill out. Give us your drink recommendations, topic recommendations, kind of centralizes things for us in our email. Yeah. Lots of ways to reach out to us and just let us know what your thoughts are and give us some topics and drinks.
Yeah, and I will say we've had quite a number of people reach out through the website portal, so that's great. And I don't know, I don't have anything else. So we have a sticker pack. We still have, while supplies last, we have a sticker pack. So if you leave a 5-star written review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or you just want to make a case for yourself, hey, I liked your shit, I shared some stuff here and there, blah, blah, blah. You can just make a case for yourself. We will send you a sticker pack. So yeah, they're nice. They're weatherproof stickers. They're cool. And having said that, let's just retroactive
and ride the wave.
Slap that ass.
when I read that, I immediately just thought like Daryl Bem was just like flashing pictures of his dick to the participants.
It's just his dick.
It's like, what'd you think of that? Huh? Pretty nice size. I don't know. That's like immediately what I thought.
Retroactive dogs.